So recently I saw what Bing had done in its latest iteration of its brand. Bing has been the most struggling and irrelevant of search engines as a brand. And one of the things that has been part of that, I'm not saying is responsible for that, but is definitely part of their persona, has been what started out as a very, very mediocre brand in terms of its identity and logo. It was poorly executed, and then it evolved into another iteration, and just in the past week or so, its latest iteration, which is filled with a number of technical issues. So I figured that I would actually tackle it and at least point out some alternative ways that this could actually be tackled as far as a brand. So here it is. Diving into this was the original Bing logo, but they basically horizontally stretched it. And so when they did that, you ended up with this kind of thing that you see in the lighter transition underneath. So it was technically, from a design standpoint, it had a lot of problems. There's a way to do that properly, and this was definitely not one of the ways, besides the fact that this just was not anything that spoke of the future, and in terms of just giving it a strong identity, it was not strong. Then they evolved into these iterations. And so we sort of have this abstract lowercase b on the left in the yellow, and then green on the right. And this here, you see the differences between the two. Besides the capital B in the green version, they closed up and modified some spaces. It wasn't particularly attractive or distinct, but it was what it was. Okay, so then it transitioned, and looking at the history, which is showing you here the extremely horizontally scaled logo, which is technically horrendous, and then it transitioned over into this Bing and then into this Bing. So it kind of like went from like the three shades of just a brand that does not look like a world-class brand. Whether you think it's ugly, whether you think it's attractive, independent of that, it does not look world-class. This is nothing I would put up against the best brands in the world. Then, of late, just recently, we saw this iteration where now the angular approach now took on this softer, more contemporary approach. It definitely was better, but there were still technical oddities and peculiarities that didn't quite make sense. So if we look at it up close, we see that we kind of have this ribbon that's kind of doing various things to form this lowercase b, and they're still using a font which looks like it's a variation on Myriad Pro, and that's basically what it looks like from what I'm seeing here. And so I looked just specifically at the mark. I wanted to just address some things that I saw. So what we see here is we have this particular angle and treatment. Now, with that, we have this particular angle and treatment now we're starting to see that, well, these things aren't quite parallel. They're not quite creating a look and a feel. And so we're going, okay, what's exactly happening here? So we're kind of like seeing, do these things line up? Is there a rhyme and a reason? How does this all work? And even the bottom, we could see that it didn't line up. It just wasn't happening. We see these incongruencies. And then we see, okay, we now have where the ribbon is supposedly becoming three-dimensional and rotating. It has this certain radius, which I have no problem with artistic license, but when it doesn't necessarily add to the look and the feel, it raises the question, why did they go that way? What I decided to do was look at what actually happens with a ribbon. And we see here with a ribbon that it has actually not a curved edge, but actually a straight edge, if we're actually looking at sort of replicating the look and a feel of a ribbon. I started to look at this and started to basically reverse engineer and see what started to make sense. And so I started to develop the forms or the facets and the different bits and the pieces, looking at the angles, and then you'll see the angles start to now, where do they line up? Where they didn't line up in the beginning, now they're starting to line up in this new version that's at least respecting what would make sense visually. So we end up with this, and then you'll see that there are some different iterations on this variation that I've explored. So you see that it's coming in front in one side and back in another side, and then it goes into a different type of three-dimensional treatment. They're all respecting the shapes, the lines, the forms. And even here, you'll see that that last bit of the ribbon is flat in front. Okay, it sort of comes from the first vertical stroke, then goes up and then goes in front. Then the next one goes from the first stroke down, which now stays in front. The middle portion is behind, and the last portion is in front. And then the last version has it so that the initial downward stroke is going down, then goes up, and then goes behind. Some of them having gradients, actually all of them having gradients, except for the first one, which was flat in front. That was addressing the issues and the technical issues on the mark. Then it became an issue of why did they pick a font as ordinary as Myriad? Myriad's a beautiful font, but there are times when you need to do certain things, and a lot of the choices of a font will be made when you look at the letters that make it up. And in this particular case, I was looking at why did they pick something with such a boring G? A G is a fabulous letter if you actually know fonts and you know design. The G they chose was completely straight, completely square, and it was not particularly beautiful or sexy or lovely. The one that I am actually proposing, or that style of G, has basically an upper bowl and a lower bowl. It goes lower, and it's just more attractive and more rhythmic. To look at these very, very closely, we have the Myriad font, which looks like what they initially based it on. Then, on top of that, we have a different font that I looked at, which was Altivo. Then there's another one, Intello. And yet, the last one, TT Supermullet, new. And that's a more angular treatment, but it's still an interesting sans serif. It still looks contemporary. And then when we look at this is their most recent iteration. You see the mark revised so that the ribbon actually makes more sense. It holds together, and it even almost looks like an arrow that points to Bing. And this is all using the Altivo font. This one is using the Intello font. And this one is using the Supermullet font. This shows what it's like looking smaller. And if you're one of those who have seen this in use, you'll see the top application and the bottom application shows what it could be like. But there it's basically showing something that actually at least holds up technically. It makes more visual sense, and that's just something that could have been explored a bit more with regard to Bing to give it more of an identity, since Bing as a brand has really been the poor stepchild in the search engine space. And this was finally an opportunity where I thought they could actually shine. So that's what I have to basically say with regard to the Bing identity. Obviously, a number of iterations can be done even more than what I've done here, but I thought it was worth a little bit of exploring. Hope you enjoyed this. Talk to you real soon. Thanks.